How does someone move from defending a faith to questioning it? Hans Mattsson, the journey didn't just happen overnight, but once it started, it changed everything. Hans was a bishop and a stake president before he was called to serve in the third quorum of the 70 in the Sweden area in Europe. He talks about having an experience with a stake president who had some difficult questions for him. And so as they sat down and tried to figure out some of those questions, he realized himself, Brother Hans, that he did not even know the questions existed. He had no answer to any of those questions. And so he thought he would go home and do some research and probably ask some of the brethren who would know. And so he then realizes that there's an assignment for him to be with Elder Elton Perry, who was then an apostle, and I take it he oversaw that area there, or presided over that area. And so he's now assigned with Elder Elton Perry to go to this stake conference. And so he uses this opportunity to organize for the stake president with himself and Elder Elton Perry to then have some form of discussion where this would be an opportunity for the stake president to then ask those questions to Elder Elton Perry, obviously with the confidence that this is an apostle and he would be able to have answers to those questions. And so he just narrates, Brother Hans, that during that meeting that they had, the three of them, Elder Elton Perry then decided that he will come back with a feedback or some of the answers, or even all the answers to the questions that they had, because these were really difficult questions that they had, and primarily they were from the book of Abraham, and some of the members were even asking the stake president some of the questions. And so these were not his personal questions, or not, at least not all, but some of the members had, as a stake president, people would think you know all the answers, you have all the answers, and you know everything. And so I take it some of the members would go to him and take those questions to him. And so he also saw an opportunity to say, okay, I've got other leaders who are above me, who might know better, who might know more. Let me inquire from them. And so Elder Elton Perry then, like I said, says no, he will come back to them. But then months go by and Elder Elton Perry doesn't come back. And Brother Hans talks about how he then phoned the office of Elder Elton Perry, and the secretary then answers. But then the secretary says, hold on, you shouldn't be asking those kind of questions to an apostle, in terms of when is he coming back with answers to our question. And when you listen to Brother Hans narrating this experience, you realize that got to him. He had so much confidence that an apostle of the Lord will have all the answers he was excited. He probably thought finally he's got the answers and he will go back to the stake president. And maybe he even had some friends in the stake who had similar questions, and he thought this was a great opportunity, but also for himself, because he didn't have any answers to those questions. And so this was a great opportunity for him to then have answers to those questions himself, and then obviously be able to give it to the stake president, and then the stake president would then share with some of the members who had those questions. But unfortunately things didn't work out that way, and I conclude that offended him. I think he was offended by Elton Perry, and that started a journey, that probably became a faith crisis for him, and eventually because he served as an area authority from 2000 to 2005. And so after he was released, he spent about 7.5 years just going on this faith of truth finding mission, just to try and find those answers for himself. He starts reading books, but something happens as he reads books. He then so he starts listening to these podcasters, and these are obviously anti-Mormon podcasters, people who probably have something against the church, or people who have done their research, so to say. And these are people who obviously, I presume they obviously want to see the downfall of the church, because they dedicate so much of their time just putting out anti-Mormon literature out there. Podcasts are all about tarnishing the name and the image of the church. But unfortunately, this brother then gets entangled with their doctrine, or rather their content. And so he starts now questioning the church, and obviously that comes with now questioning the leaders. He starts now doubting. So the cracks of doubt are now creeping in and starting to show, because he now stops going to church, because now he's got all this information, and some of the questions now that he didn't have himself are creeping in. He starts now asking hard questions, which now are obviously hampering his faith. And so because he stops going to church now, something interestingly happens. The bishop decides to visit the home, and so the bishop finds the wife, and the bishop sits with the wife, and he asks some difficult questions that the wife didn't really appreciate. And so she talks about how those questions were uncomfortable, because he didn't understand why the bishop would ask those kind of questions about his or her husband, but also the manner that the bishop asked, sort of like trying to judge and cast aspersion, and sort of accuse Brother Hans of trying to lure some of the members, and trying to be apostate, and trying to just teach in false doctrine, and trying to uh, lead some of the members astray. So the wife wasn't really happy with that visit. And so obviously she informs the husband, and then they take this up. They take it to the stake president. And I think the meeting with the stake president didn't go so well, because it made things worse. Because now the wife starts doubting. She starts questioning things now. She starts questioning the church, and she's like, okay, hold on, I know my husband, I trust my husband, that's why I've married him. So perhaps he's onto something. If all these people, all our leaders that we trust, are raising such questions in this manner, perhaps my husband is onto something. So let me try and find out for myself. And so she also goes into this rabbit hole and starts reading the same literature that the husband is reading. Starts listening now to this podcast, because initially she was questioning the husband to be like, hold on, why are you now going on to this path, listening to this podcast, reading this anti-Mormon literature? But now she finds herself reading those same books, listening now with the husband this podcast. And so she stops now going to church, because according to her, the family was more important than the church. So eventually they leave. For me, this is one of the saddest stories, and I say that with sincerity, because I know that there are members who don't agree with what Brother Hans did together with his wife. They talk about the Sweden rescue, where I think it was Elder Russell M. Nelson then who went down to Sweden to sort of try and quench this fire that was caused by Brother Hans and his wife, and because obviously some members trusted Brother Hans, and so they were probably having the same questions, and so he showed them these books, helped them to find this podcast, and so they were sort of like, when they talk about the unity of the wounded, and so Elder Russell M. Nelson is one of the leaders who the church sent down there to try and help things. But unfortunately, some of the members didn't think or thought things didn't go well with the leaders. Some thought that no, the church was just trying to cover up things and trying to make excuses, and didn't really delve much into the root cause and try to answer some of the pertinent questions that the members had. But it's a really, really sad story, and it helps you to realize that even experienced leaders can struggle. Can you imagine, this is an Area 70, one of the trusted, but he had questions. Right before he was even released, he started going into this path. He started to have doubt creeping in. But you also, it helps you, this story helps you to understand what happens when doubt outweighs faith. Obviously, if you doubt too much and you are focusing only on doubt, your faith is going to decline. You're going to start questioning things that meant so much for you will start to be normal. You'll just be in there, you're physically there, but emotionally and mentally you are somewhere else. And I think that Brother Hans and his wife really were challenged. They were really facing a crisis here. And like I said, when doubt is so much that even your faith starts to lag, then you get into this path where you traverse on dangerous paths that might even destroy your testimony. But I'm thinking that this is something that we can learn from. It's a story that you and I can learn from. I'm thinking of, we've lost so many leaders, and I'm talking now about former leaders, bishops, or even branch presidents and stake presidents who are no longer with us. And these are men that we trusted. These are men that these are men that you sought guidance and counsel from, you respected, but something happens after they are released. But just like Brother Hans, this is not something that just happens overnight. It's a journey that they start walking on, and eventually things end up badly, and we end up losing this brethren. But I'm thinking like the Hans, Sister Hans talks about how she felt like people were now starting to see them as parasites, as these people who are just trying to destroy the church, and not necessarily understanding that they had doubts, they had questions that just needed answers. And I think sometimes we might also fall into that trap of looking at these former leaders and trying to judge them, trying to condemn them. Sometimes we say those things that, this guy, he was a bishop, how could he have fallen? Or didn't he understand these things? Or he taught these things when he was the bishop. He used to come early when he was a stake president, now he comes late. Sometimes you see former leaders, they were so strict in how they dress when they come to church in terms of their grooming. And now when they are released, they're just casual. Sometimes they don't even wear their ties. Sometimes they just wear colorful shirts. You see those things. And then it might be easy when you are sitting there wearing your full attire in terms of a white shirt and a tie, and you are fully shaven. It might be easy to look at the brother and want to, judge them and even label them as apostate, and trying to caution members to not be around them. But I think this story can then help us to understand that we don't necessarily need to encourage their doubting, but we also don't have any right, to judge these former leaders. These are our brethren. We love them, and we should want to see them come back. And I hope that it's something that we can really sit down and say, we have lost so many former leaders. How do we like we talked about return missionaries and how we try to bring them back into the fold. We've got former leaders who've got questions now, who are doubting now. They doubted things that they held so dear to themselves, things that they believed, things that they saw as sacred. Now they just see them as meaningless. They critique, and sometimes they make fun of those sacred things. Some leaders, former leaders, they make fun of temple ordinances. But if you speak to them and you ask them how did you feel when you went there, they will tell you straight. They felt the spirit, they felt good, but something along the line changed. But unfortunately, instead of us allowing them to have these questions, because the church is not against members having questions, not at all. And that's why they try to set up some websites where they can be able to respond to. Maybe they will have researchers and people who know these things write essays and respond to some of the questions that we might have. But unfortunately, Brother Hans and his wife had challenges with some historical doctrine that was obviously explained or even reversed. Some of the decisions in the past were reversed. We no longer practice those things, but they still had questions with those things. They didn't, it didn't sit well that the church practiced those things or those teachings back in the days. And so they went in this rabbit hole and found out what some of the past leaders were involved in, and they started now to question, how could a man be called of God be involved with such things? And one of them would be, why would the Lord deprive his other children of having the priesthood? And I guess this is just faith versus context, because sometimes we have to then understand the context of how those teachings were brought about. But yeah, that's what happens sometimes. And I don't mean to condemn any of the former leaders who have gone astray or who have left the church, but I do take it really doesn't sit well with me when former leaders whom we trusted then decide to take it upon themselves to be now advocates of trying to get members away from the church, and referring them to this anti-Mormon literature, anti-Mormon podcasts. That doesn't really sit well with me. I won't condemn anyone, I won't judge anyone. I respect that people have different views on certain topics, certain issues. That's why I don't have any issue with anyone having questions. I think questions will arise. It's just a matter of how and what we do in terms of going about searching and finding those questions. When you listen to some of the podcasts that Brother Hans did, he talks about while he was on this path of finding answers for himself, because he talks about how he was going on this path because he wanted to prove that the church was true. And for me, that was interesting, because this was a bishop. He was a stake president. He was an area 70, and for him to say he was on a path to try and find out if the church was true, for me, I found that very interesting to say. Does it mean when he was an area authority, he didn't have that testimony of the church being true? But you never know, but he was on that mission. And he says that he started to listen to podcasters. And for me, that was interesting, because he repeated it multiple times to say that he started listening to podcasters and other people. And those other people were not leaders of the church. Those other podcasters that he was listening to were not pro-Mormon, if I use that word, Mormon, and I think that's where our faith crisis starts. When we start listening to other people other than the people we should be listening to, and who are the 12 apostles, our leaders, our stake presidents and our bishops. We start, using podcasts as a source of truth, instead of using the scriptures as a source of truth. Instead of using the general conference talks for guidance and as a platform where we can find answers to our questions, we go on other platforms which are not necessarily aligned with what we believe in and what we subscribe to. And obviously, these are not members of our church. Some were members of our church and decided to leave. And obviously, they have something against the church. And so they are on this mission of trying to, and I think that's one thing that maybe if perhaps if there are some things that I learn also from this, is that sometimes we do confuse losing spiritual ground and some intellectual honesty, and by that I mean, like, for example, if someone comes and starts bashing the prophet Joseph Smith and start talking about polygamy and start revealing all these things that we did not know, we start looking at these people as heroes. We start saying these guys are confident, they are questioning leaders, and we praise those people for doing those things. And we don't really realize that, no, hold on, these are just people losing spiritual ground and not necessarily heroes. Like I say, they start belittling sacred things, and because they are vocal about their questioning and their fight against the church leaders, we hold them at a high esteem and say these are confident men or women, and these are people we want to align ourselves with. And like I said, we make them heroes. We make heroes out of them to say they are vocal. This is what the church needs. We need to be more open. Nothing should be kept secret, and that's a problem. And I think we should really caution against that, where we try and make people who question the leaders. I mean, like I said, there's nothing wrong to question, but the manner in which we question, whereas we now try to discredit the leaders of the church and eventually discrediting the church itself. I mean, that's a dangerous path. It's okay to have questions, but we should have them in a dignified manner. Ask questions where you should be asking them, but be willing then to be referred to scriptures and to leaders of the church, and not try and make the church then, make those podcasters that you listen to a source of truth and knowledge, because we believe that these prophets are men called of God, and they receive revelation from the Lord himself. And so once our faith and once we dwindles and we begin to doubt, we are then going to get to a point where we even question the existence of the Lord. So once you question the existence of Jesus Christ, you then question the reality of these men receiving revelation, because how can they receive a revelation from someone who does not exist? So the prophet Daniel H. Oakes, now he speaks for the Lord. So the Lord does exist. I sustain him with all my heart. I know that he's a prophet called of God. Uh, will the church have more critics in the future? Of course. Will we have questions about some of the decisions that the brethren are taking now? Of course. Will we have questions about things that happened in the past? Of course. But why should we doubt what we already know? You know, for me personally, there's not a living person, not a single person who is alive now who will make me discredit the prophet Joseph Smith. And just for a simple reason that the people who lived with the prophet Joseph Smith, the people who had all the right, all the authority, all the time, and the ability to discredit the prophet Joseph Smith when he was alive and dead while they were still alive could not do that. So why would I allow someone who's alive now to try and discredit the prophet Joseph Smith or the Book of Mormon or any doctrine that we receive? If there are any questions, let us take them to the Lord. You know, let us go and ask the Lord. I mean, if we believe and we trust God and we don't doubt, I think it was D.F. Uchtdorf who said that faith and doubt cannot exist in the same place at the same time. One will dispel the other. And so I think if we exercise more faith and take these questions to God, and he will definitely and surely he will answer us. And let us stop trying to look for things that are wrong. You know, I think there are people who are just, you know, dedicating so much of their time and so much of their energy in trying to find what is wrong with the church. You know, there is so much good. But unfortunately, once you start focusing on the bad, you are just going to see bad because that's what you are looking for. You know, and I'm hoping one day that Brother Hans and his wife will come back to the church. You know, I listened to him speak and you realize that he's a good man. You know, but unfortunately he's in a phase now, and his faith is tested, and it's his journey that him and unfortunately the wife decided to, you know, support him in this journey instead of trying to, you know, be the other part of the yoke. When the one is weak, the other should be strong, and that will happen, you know, in marriages, in relationships where people feel that they should support each other even when they are going in the wrong direction. But yeah, let's just for me personally, I'm praying and hoping that he will one day together with his wife return to full fellowship, just like I pray, you know, and hope for all the leaders, past leaders who have left. You know, I'm hoping that whatever is troubling them, whatever offended them, whatever questions and doubts that they are finding themselves in will be resolved, and that they will make that determination to mend things with the church and come back, and that all will be forgiven, and that we can be able to also forgive them, you know. And yeah, I think they are good men, and that's why they were called in the first place. But unfortunately, they are now tested. But yeah, let us not judge these men. You know, if there's any leader currently now that you know that might be struggling with faith, they are starting to question things, they are starting to, you know, doubt a little here and there, I think we need to be there for them. You know, we need to be more encouraging, we need to be praying for them. You know, we need to just help them to if they have questions, even if it's not leaders, you know, any member for that matter, who has a question about any teaching, any doctrine, any policy of the church, I think we should be patient enough, you know, loving enough to sit them down and refer them to the right passage of scriptures and the handbook of instruction, conference talks, and say, this is what the leaders have said about this issue, this policy, this doctrine. Would you consider what they are saying here and take it to the Lord? You know, I think if we are just more loving, and some people will realize that there are answers to their questions, whether they are ready to hear those answers now or not. But we should be confident to say we have afforded them the opportunity to ask whatever questions they've had. Let us not chase people away just because they have questions. And perhaps it is us who have questions. Let us not doubt. You know, let us not spend so much time doubting what we already know to be true. Or just because we don't know now does not mean these things are not true. Let us take it to the Lord. Let us ask him to help us to understand and know if these things are true or not. But yeah, that's a bit of what I thought maybe we should be focusing on now, that when people have doubts and there are maybe cracks in terms of their faith is showing, let us be there for them and not condemn them till the end. All right, sharp, sharp.